Hey everybody, this is Dr. A, and in this video lesson, we've got an opportunity to introduce our next topic or our next system to explore. And this system we just simply call the reproductive system. Now, as we get started with this, I just want to put two questions before you today. And the first question, or both of these questions, are actually rhetorical questions. But here's something that I'd like you to think about. One is, how old is the world? And the second question that I'd like you to think about for just a second is, how long has mankind existed? Now, for both of these questions, you might feel as though you've got an answer to that, or I'm sure a quick Google search might give you an estimate for how old the world is or for how long mankind has existed. But regardless of what the exact answer is, or maybe regardless of what you think or what you believe about this, one thing is for sure, that mankind, we, have been here on this earth for a long time. And there's one particular thing that allows for us to say that that's true. And it is this act that we call procreation. And so procreation allows us as human beings the opportunity to do two things in particular. It gives us the opportunity to bring life into this world, but not only that, it also gives us the opportunity to ensure that life is sustained here. Now, if this is the first time you've heard this word procreation before, it really just means sexual reproduction. And so, again, this is why we've been able to last as long as we have. We've been able to reproduce. Now, when we talk about reproduction, this happens or is possible because of two reproductive cells. And those two reproductive cells are, one, the sperm, and the ova or ovum. Now, just so you'll have this, ova is the singular form of this particular word, and then ovum is the plural form of this word. And this is going to be a term that we come back to here in just a moment, so just want you to make sure you've got that for now. But once these two cells come together, what's going to happen is we'll ultimately have a fusion of those two. Now, to help with the fusion of those two types of cells, we definitely are going to have the endocrine system play a huge role in this. And of course, you'll remember that our endocrine system relates to all of the hormones that are working and acting in the body, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment. But it's through endocrine regulation or through hormonal regulation that these two types of cells can lead to the development of an infant. And of course, from an infant to ultimately an adult. And so again, this is where we have to start when we talk about this idea of sexual reproduction. Now, one of the things that I'd like to do is take just a few moments and to review what I believe is some essential terminology here as it relates to the reproductive system. There are some key terms that I think if we get a good understanding of these terms, we really start to get a better understanding of how this system functions, which is what we mean when we talk about physiology. Now, the word that I'd like us to begin with here is this term that we call gonads. Now, one of the things that I love doing anytime I'm studying or looking at terms that relate to anatomy, physiology, medical terminology, whatever it might be, is to look at what a word literally means, because I believe it gives us so much within that. But the term gonads literally means either seed or generation. So you may have a friend or a relative, someone who's a little older, and they may say to someone when they're talking about a relative or maybe their son or daughter, they may say, yeah, that's my seed. And what they're saying is, yeah, I had a role in producing this one or making this person. Or we could think about it this way, with gonads meaning generation, I want you to make the connection that it's these things, gonads, that we're going to talk a little bit more about in just a second, that are responsible for helping us to essentially build the next generation. So if we look back at this term here for a second, this is a term that represents both the male and female reproductive organs. And both of these male and female reproductive organs, they produce something that's unique for us. They produce gametes. Now, just so that we're clear here, when we talk about the gonads, we're talking about the testes for the male, and we're talking about the ovaries for the female. Now, in parentheses here, we've got testis, which is essentially the singular form, and then we've got ovary here, which is, of course, the singular form as well. And so we're saying that these two things, our testes and our ovaries, help produce gametes. And those gametes are what we can refer to as the male and female reproductive cells. And so we actually talked about that just a moment ago, but those male and female reproductive cells would be things like the sperm and the ova or ovum. Now, in order for this to work, in order for sexual reproduction to do what it's supposed to do, we've definitely got to have the interaction of hormones. Without hormones, it's just not possible. And so I want you to think back for just a moment that we've talked about the classification system for hormones. You'll remember that we've got steroid hormones and we've got non-steroid hormones. Remember that it's our steroid hormones that have cholesterol as a base for each of those types of hormones, and then we've got our non-steroid hormones, and there are varying types of those, but all of those are going to play a huge role in how we're able to reproduce or build the next generation. Now, the next term that I want to share with you is this term that we refer to as ducts. Now, ducts are essentially passageways through the reproductive system. And it's through these ducts or these passageways that our gametes are able to transport throughout the body, and it's through these passageways that we're able to essentially start the reproductive process. So again, when you see the word ducts, just want you to think about passageways here. Now, the next term that I'd like us to look at is accessory glands. And for accessory glands, these are glands that secrete fluids into the reproductive system ducts. Okay, so again, our glands secrete things into the ducts so that the reproductive system functions appropriately. Now, this term, accessory glands, is primarily a term that we use as it relates to the male reproductive system. And so the accessory glands that I want to share with you for the next few moments is what we would call the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland. And you may be very familiar with the prostate gland. That is definitely something that males are generally concerned about as they get older. They want to ensure that they don't have things like prostate cancer. But anyway, these are accessory glands. Now, we don't typically use this term, accessory glands, with the female reproductive system. However, there are components of the female reproductive system that definitely aid in how the female reproductive system works, and we'll explore that when the time comes for that. But again, I just want to reiterate that we don't necessarily use this term accessory gland with the female reproductive system. Now, regardless of us looking at or exploring the male reproductive system or the female reproductive system, both of these systems have external genitalia. Of course, for males, the external genitalia includes the penis and the scrotum, and for females, it includes the vagina and the breast. So I know that this is kind of basic or entry level, but I think again, to help us get a really good understanding of the system, we need to at least understand some of the basic terminology. And you might agree with me here. I think that it's the reproductive system that maybe we understand the least. Just to be completely open and transparent with you, this is a system that I've needed to go back and look at a little bit more to make sure I have a really good understanding of it before trying to share with you all the content about this system. But it's so vast that we definitely need to understand it, because this is how we come to be. So anyway, let's move along to the next piece here. So let's take just a second here and let's give a snapshot review for both the male and female reproductive systems. Now we'll start with the male reproductive system, and if you're following along with me in your lecture notes, we're going to fill in a few blanks here. In adult males, it is the testes or the male gonads that secrete sex hormones, and we generally will refer to these sex hormones as androgens. And specifically, androgens just refers to male sex characteristic hormones. And the one that we're most interested in or concerned about is the male sex hormone called testosterone. Now again, that doesn't mean that we can't have or we don't find testosterone in females, but in general, testosterone is normally related to or associated with being a male sex characteristic hormone. Now in our next spot here, here's what we've got. The testes also produce the male gametes called spermatozoa or spermatozoon. So this is the more appropriate term or the more appropriate way for us to refer to those male gametes. But we generally just use a shortened version of those terms just so that we're on the same page as well, and we just simply refer to it as sperm for short. Now, taking a little bit of a turn here, let's talk about the male reproductive system as it relates to reproduction or sexual intercourse. Now, what's unique about males is that there are roughly 1.5 billion sperm produced each day. So kind of just a unique fact here. Again, 1.5 billion sperm produced each day. Now, during sexual intercourse, there is something that we refer to as emission or the release of the sperm. And it's during emission that mature sperm travel along our duct system. So remember, we talked about that term duct just a second ago. Our ducts are essentially kind of our passageways for components of the reproductive system to travel and get to where they need to get to. So as our sperm travels through the duct, what they will do is they will meet up with the products of some of our accessory glands. And once that happens, once we have the release of things from our accessory glands, and once they mix in with the developed sperm, we actually call that product semen. And so it's the semen that is released from the male that goes into the female, of course, and that's going to be one of the very first stages of initiating reproduction. Now, let's take a look at the female reproductive system here in a snapshot. It's in our adult females that we have the ovaries, or what we could call the female gonads. And it's these particular gonads or ovaries that release what we call one immature gamete, which is an oocyte, once per month. And later on, we'll talk a little bit more about this and how this relates to the female cycles that are important for us to have some understanding about. But again, I want us to make sure we've got that. Now, here's the next thing. This immature gamete either it's going to travel up one or two of the uterine tubes, and ultimately it will end up in a muscular organ that we refer to as the uterus. Now, again, kind of going to sexual reproduction here, or through the act of sexual intercourse, if a sperm reaches this oocyte, this gamete that we've talked about, and if they fuse together, we call that process fertilization. And once we've had the process of fertilization to occur, we now refer to that oocyte as an ovum. Now, last but not least here, the short passageway called the vagina is what connects the uterus to the exterior. Or we can think of it this way. The vagina is essentially the entryway to the uterus. All right, so let's take kind of all of these things that we've heard about, and let's look at an image here to see if we can kind of map out exactly what we've talked about thus far. So let's take a look at what we've just talked about here, but let's use an image to hopefully paint this picture a little bit better. What we talked about in part was an overview of the male and female reproductive systems, but we also talked in part also about the act of reproduction. And so it's that act of reproduction that I want us to visit here for just a moment. Now, if we look at number 1 on the screen here, what we're saying is that it's through sexual intercourse and by way of ejaculation that semen enters the vagina. Now, the term ejaculation here is one that we haven't mentioned yet. We used earlier the term emission, and emission is essentially the same thing. It is the release of semen from the male reproductive system. Now, remember that we get semen as a byproduct of sperm mixing with the end products of the accessory glands associated with the male reproductive system. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to move to kind of the second point here, or the image that you see. And first, I just want to give you kind of a full layout of what's happening here. What we're looking at is the female reproductive system, at least in part. This is part of it. And so what we have here is the vagina. We've got the fallopian tubes that we see on both sides here. We have the uterus, and we have the uterine lining here as well. Now, off to the sides, we have the ovaries. And so here's what I want us to see. What we've said so far is that once per month, these ovaries are going to release something that we call an oocyte. And that's this green circle that you see here. And although it's not shown here, what happens is that once this oocyte makes its way into the fallopian tube, this end portion, kind of see these hair-like projections, they essentially are going to close up to kind of secure the process that follows. And so what happens next is that this oocyte is going to move up through the fallopian tube. And it's going to kind of wait here for the next thing to happen. Now, again, through the process or through the act of sexual intercourse, the sperm is going to be introduced into the vagina. And just as we've mentioned, the job of the sperm here is to rush through the vagina, to ascend through the vaginal tract here. And the sperm will ultimately end up in the fallopian tubes. Now, what will happen next is that we'll have a large number of the sperm that try to enter or penetrate the oocyte. But what will happen is that there will only be one that is successful. And once one of the sperm has penetrated the oocyte, we're saying that that now becomes the ovum. So that's going to kind of go from this positioning that we have here, and that ovum is going to be deposited into the uterus. And so here's what we're saying. Once fertilization occurs, or once we've got the meshing of the sperm and the oocyte, the uterus will then enclose itself, and that's going to prepare it to support a developing embryo as it grows into a fetus and then ultimately prepares for the process of birth. Now, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive in exploring the male reproductive system. Now, the male reproductive system, as we've discussed before, the primary sexual organs or the gonads are the testes. Now, these testes hang within the scrotum, and that is just essentially a fleshy pouch of skin that is suspended from the base of the penis. Now, when we kind of delve into and explore what the scrotum is all about, we'll see here that the scrotum is divided into two chambers, or sometimes you may hear them referred to as scrotal cavities. But whether we refer to them as chambers or cavities, the important thing for us to note is that, again, these contain the testes. And if we needed to give a description to what the testes look like, we could just essentially say that they are in the shape of a flattened egg. Now, here's what I want to get to for just a second. Beneath the scrotal cavity lies a muscle that we refer to as the Cremaster Muscle, and it is responsible for contracting the testes and bringing it closer to the body. And so here's what I want to show you. If we take a look at this picture, what we have are the scrotal cavities or the scrotal chambers here. And specifically, it's kind of this darkened area that you see here that represents that particular cavity. Now, kind of nestled inside of this cavity, we actually see the full testis here. Now, underneath our scrotal cavities, here's where we find that cremaster muscle. It's kind of this pinkish outline that you see here. That's the cremaster muscle. Now, again, what we said just a moment ago is that the job of this cremaster muscle is it is meant to help contract the testes or bring them closer to the body. So here's what we're saying. If it's warm or if the air or body temperature increases for a male, what's going to happen is that this cremaster muscle relaxes. And so that allows for the scrotum to not be drawn as close to the body. And on the flip side of that, if it's cold or if the air or the body temperature decreases for a male, then the cremaster muscle is going to contract, meaning that the testes are drawn closer to the body. Now you may say, okay, that's great. It's good to know that information, but what does this mean? What can I do with that information? Well, part of the reason that we talk about this is that the cremaster muscle is very important. This reflex or this act that we just read about here is oftentimes referred to as the cremaster reflex. And sometimes nurses or doctors will use this reflex to ensure that things are working properly for the male reproductive system. But something else that we need to understand here is that this reflex also works to essentially maintain homeostasis of a process that we'll talk about in just a moment called spermatogenesis. So here's what we're saying. The testes like to remain at a temperature that is between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius lower than the individual's body temperature. And so all that means is that the testes like to remain in a cooler environment than the normal body temperature in order for spermatogenesis to occur. And when we talk about spermatogenesis here in just a moment, that might make even more sense. But what we're saying again, just to kind of put this in a nutshell, the goal is for our bodies, testes for the males, the goal is for the testes to continuously be producing sperm, Remember, just a moment ago, we talked about how 500 million are produced every day. And so in order for that process to continue, the testes have to be within a certain temperature. So that's why it's important for us to know a little bit more about the Cremaster muscle. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive in exploring the male reproductive system here. Now, each testis is wrapped in what we call a dense fibrous capsule. We call this dense fibrous capsule the tunica albuginea. Again, it's pronounced the tunica albuginea. And this capsule essentially provides a protective mechanism for the testes. And this capsule ends up forming something that we call the septa. So if you take a look at the picture here on the right hand side, the septa is here, and what the septa does is it creates kind of these neatly packaged columns, if you will. And so to that point, distributed throughout the testes are approximately 800 tightly coiled seminiferous tubules. And it's the seminiferous tubules that we'll find within each of the neatly packaged septa that we just talked about here. Now, here's something that I want to make sure you've got written down. The seminiferous tubules here, these are the sites of sperm production. And so as sperm is produced here, what ultimately is going to happen is that they're going to leave the seminiferous tubules, and they leave through something that we call the Reit Testis. And here's that term, the Reit Testis. And so the Reit Testis is essentially kind of this network that you see here right in the middle. And as the sperm enter the Reit Testis, they're going to exit through what we call these efferent ductules. And as they enter those efferent ductules, they're going to go into what we call the epididymis. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the epididymis in just a moment, but this is where the sperm kind of essentially wait and they become a little bit more mature. And we call that, the epididymis, really the beginning point of the male reproductive tract. Now, one of the terms that we mentioned just a little while ago was spermatogenesis. That's the process, of course, in which sperm are produced and or manufactured. And so here's something that I want to let you see here. The male reproductive cell, or what we could call the gametes, now that we've got some terminology under our belt, is the spermatozoa or the spermatozoon. But remember, we said that we typically just refer to it as sperm for short. So here's what I want to do. I just want to give you kind of some of the terminology here that represents parts of the sperm. So let's kind of start at the beginning here. This capsule that you see is what we call the acrosome. Again, it's just the capsule that covers what's also known as the head of the sperm. Now, right in between the head of the sperm and the structure that we have here is what we call the centriole. And shortly right after the centriole, we have the mid piece of the sperm. And it's the mid piece of the sperm that we'll actually find the mitochondria. And of course, this is going to be what powers the sperm to travel at the speeds that it does as it races to try to meet an oocyte for fertilization. And then at the end here, we simply will just call this the tail. And this is what's going to give the sperm motility, or the ability to move about. So again, this is what our male reproductive gonads or organs do. They create these spermatozoa. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into our exploration of the male reproductive system. Let's look at it from an internal view and also an external view. And so for our internal view, what I'd like you to do here is to identify some of the structures that are highlighted here on your sheet and then we'll also identify some of their functions as well. So the first one that I'd like for us to talk about here is of course on the far left hand side, and we're going to highlight this one and or identify this as the seminal vesicle. And this is the seminal vesicle here. And what this does is it produces a large portion of the ingredients that make up sperm. And so if we want to get very technical, it makes up somewhere of between 60 and 70% of the total volume of semen. Now, the next one that we have here is the prostate gland, which is this structure that you see here. And the prostate gland secretes a fluid that nourishes the sperm. And here in just a second, you're going to see how the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and the next one that we talk about, how they're uniquely connected. And so the third one that we'll look at here is what we refer to as the bulbourethral gland, or sometimes you may hear this commonly referred to as Calpers gland. Now, Calpers gland is activated essentially through or during sexual intercourse or through sexual stimulation. And part of what this does is help to provide lubrication for the penis so that intercourse is easier and so that it's not as difficult. But also something that's really unique about this is that the mucus that this particular gland produces is very alkaline, or what we can say is basic. And this alkalinity of this mucus actually helps to contrast or counter the traditional acidity of the vagina. So it's kind of unique that kind of goes back to our discussion on acid-base balance, so to speak. But again, just a unique thing for us to look at. But here's the connection that I want you to see. Notice the location of the seminal vesicle, the location of the prostate gland here, and the location of Calpers gland. You can see that these are all uniquely lined up with one another. And you can also see that they provide kind of a unique and direct passageway directly into the penis. And so again, that makes sense because they all are intimately connected to the process and development of semen. Now, if we move to kind of the right side of this, here's what I want us to identify here. We've got the ureter, we've got the urinary bladder, the urethra, of course we've got the penis, and then there is the foreskin that covers the end of the penis. Now, with the term ureter, here's what I want you to know. This is essentially connected in large part to the urinary system. That's the primary focus here. And what it does is it carries urine from the kidney. Remember, we've kind of talked about the filtration process that goes on there. It carries urine from the kidney directly into the urinary bladder, which is this hollow muscular structure that you see here. Now, of course, the urinary bladder does what it does, and it essentially just holds our urine. Now, if we go just below this to the highlighted structure here, we've got the urethra. And notice that this urethra kind of serves two major functions. It is the exit pathway for urine, so connected to the urinary system, of course, and it's also the exit pathway for semen, which represents kind of the dual nature of this area for the male. It serves as the urinary output center and also the reproductive organ as well. So that's kind of our internal view of the male reproductive system. Now, if we look to the right-hand side for the external view, this just kind of gives us an idea of the male external genitalia that we talked about earlier. And of course, we've got the scrotum here, and we've got the penis. And here's kind of what's unique about this, and we'll see this also for the external view of the female reproductive system. But what we've got here is something that's referred to as the Eurogenital Triangle. Essentially, this just kind of outlines two things. If we look at the term here, it outlines part of the male reproductive system that's connected to the urinary system, hence the beginning of this term, uro, and then genital, referring to the genitals, which essentially refers to the reproductive organs. So again, this is our Eurogenital Triangle, and then just below that, we have something referred to as the Anal Triangle. Essentially just representing here where the anus is and how, of course, this is where fecal matter will be released from. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive and let's cover essentially the next to the last content that we have for this particular lesson. One of the things that we're going to uncover here is the process of spermatogenesis. And so here's kind of the entire goal of the male reproductive system. The goal is for the gonads, which essentially would be the testes. The goal is for them to produce gametes. And remember, those gametes for the male reproductive system would be what we call spermatozoa or spermatozoon. Now, again, as we've said before, we simply use the term sperm for short. So here's the thing that I want us to see. In order to initiate spermatogenesis, we have to have three processes in action. The first is mitosis, and we've had an opportunity to talk about this before, but the second is meiosis or meiosis, and the third is spermiogenesis. So again, mitosis, meiosis, and spermiogenesis. Now, hopefully you'll remember that for mitosis, this simply represents the normal life cycle of a given cell. And so we used a mnemonic last time to kind of help us remember what mitosis was all about. Kind of the phrase or the question is, are my toes sexy? And we said that more often than not, it would be almost incredibly difficult for us to say that someone's toes looked sexy. So we used this as a reminder that the process of mitosis essentially has nothing to do with sex. And so, again, it represents the normal life cycle of any given cell. And if you think back to our earlier discussions as well, you can probably remember the parts of it. We've got G1 or gap phase 1. We've got the S phase or the synthesis phase, gap phase 2, and then we had the M phase. And that included a few things. Remember, we had prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then cytokinesis here as well. So again, that's mitosis. That is a part of this process. But the second one, meiosis or meiosis, this produces gametes. And so now we've got a little bit more understanding about that term. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So it produces gametes, or cells that contain half the number of chromosomes found in other cells. And so remember, kind of our mnemonic device for this is meiosis. And so we use this to be a reminder that this is what can help us remember the story of how you, the me part, and your sister came into being. If we needed to tell that story, it would most likely have to do something with sexual reproduction. So again, that's how we can clear those two terms up from one another. Now, the third one is spermiogenesis. Not to be confused with spermatogenesis, even though they sound similar, they're a little bit different, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But it's through the process of spermiogenesis that small, relatively unspecialized spermatids develop into fully mature sperm. Now, here's what I want us to see. This is kind of the full process of spermatogenesis here. And this is first going to start with mitosis. Again, that's the normal life cycle of any given cell. Now, the cells that we start with here are referred to as spermatogonium. Now, what happens through mitosis is that we'll have a single cell, a single spermatogonium, that is essentially duplicated or replicated so that we have two primary spermatocytes. Now, I've kind of added one in here just to kind of show this process in a little bit more detail. But what the rest of this process does is essentially just gives us the opportunity to focus on one of those two particular primary spermatocytes. Now, I've got the number 46 listed here at the top, and that's just an indication that for this particular cell, we've got a total of 46 chromosomes. Now, half of these come from the male's mother, and the other half come from the male's father. But what happens next is that we're going to go through two cycles of meiosis, meiosis 1 and also meiosis 2. So for meiosis 1, what happens is our primary spermatocytes are going to change so that we now have two secondary spermatocytes. Now, after that stage has been completed, our two secondary spermatocytes are going to yield for us a total of 4 haploid spermatids. So essentially what's happened is we went from kind of the full version of the male's DNA and our primary spermatocytes to each of our haploid spermatids having different versions of the male's genetic makeup, with essentially 23 chromosomes here. Now, although it's not shown, what will happen next is we'll have the process of spermiogenesis, where these haploid spermatids eventually become mature sperm cells. So let's take a look at this in sequence here. We've got a few numbered steps, and here's the first one. Sperm develop in the seminiferous tubule within the testes. We've talked about that earlier, but this is just a way for us to recap what we've talked about thus far. Now, immature sperm cells called spermatogonia, which we talked about just a moment ago, they actually lie dormant until puberty. So here's what we're saying. This process doesn't kick up or doesn't start until puberty. But at puberty, the spermatogonia or spermatogonium, they undergo mitosis and become primary spermatocytes. From here, these cells undergo meiosis 1 and form two smaller haploid cells called secondary spermatocytes. And from here, these secondary spermatocytes divide once more and form 4 haploid cells called spermatids, and again, they contain half of the father's genetic material. Again, number 6, through the process of spermiogenesis, the spermatids change shape and become mature sperm cells. And the last part of this process is that the sperm cells are then stored in the epididymis, which we again refer to as the beginning of the reproductive tract. So that's it for this particular video lesson. I hope it's been helpful in giving you a better understanding of the reproductive system as a whole, but then specifically as it relates to the male reproductive system. Thank you. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I'd be more than happy to talk with you a little bit more about this particular system.